Hello, my name is Holly. Welcome to Suspense She Shed Sunday. Boy, do I have a true crime story for you today. It's about serial killer Robert Zarinsky. But first, hit like and subscribe for true crime in my Murder She Shed, where we talk about criminals, suspects, and the dead. Relax, you could even crawl in bed
so I can put nightmares into your head.
Robert Zarinsky was born September 4th, 1940. He was son of Julius Zarinsky and Veronica Matinko. As a boy, Robert was said to have been way overprotected by his mother, as a lot of serial killers are, or their mother's mean. Robert was king and his mother was queen. Robert would beat and torture his sisters with his mother's approval. Also, he would torture small animals and cut off their head. Serial killer, check mark. His mother, Veronica, ignored his bullying behavior and always claimed it was the other person's fault. It wasn't my little Robert's. As a teenager, Zarinsky threatened to blow up the home of a girl in town who had been forbidden by her parents to see him. When Robert knocked his father off of a kitchen chair, Veronica just walked out of the room. And then he would call his dad dumb Jew, and she pretended not even to hear. Zarinsky was a mediocre student who graduated from Linden High School in 1958. And he joined his father in the family business, delivering produce to restaurants and grocery stores. He eventually forcefully took control of his dad's business, giving his father only $5 weekly allowance and beating him when he complained. At 21, he was caught setting fires and toppling 1,500 headstones. Not sure why. And so a judge committed Zarinsky to a mental hospital for evaluations. Psychiatrists diagnosed him as having paranoid schizophrenia. They said he suffered from delusions and hallucinations. He spent a year there where he was given electric shock therapy. He received huge bolts of electricity to his brain. How does that help? I don't know. Oh, like his brain's not already damaged enough. Afterward, he only received 3 years of probation. When Robert was just 18, him and his cousin decided to rob a pharmacy, and Robert ended up shooting the officer. But him and his cousin got shot as well. So he just went back home to Mommy, where Mommy laid him on the kitchen table and pulled the bullets out of them and said, "Don't ever tell what happened." When Robert was 21, when most boys are just thinking about, hey, I can legally drink alcohol. Not Robert. He had other things on his mind. He happened to be driving by a pool where 14-year-old Sharon Kennedy and 2 friends were walking back home after a hot day at the pool. It was a blistering hot day. And when Robert pulled up in his convertible and offered them a ride, it seemed like a cool way to get home with this hot sun just beating down on their backs. So Robert first took her friends home, and then instead of stopping at her house, he turned the opposite direction, and he took Sharon into a wooded area, and Sharon was terrified probably. And there he punched her in the chest and began tearing at her clothes. He took her bra off and tied her hands behind her head and began to bite her all over her body. He punched her in the head and she bit him on the arm. She got a good chunk out of him and was able to escape from the vehicle. But he caught her and drug her back to the vehicle. And then did a really odd thing. He just drove her back home like nothing ever happened. When Sharon got home, Everyone was asleep, so she didn't say a word about the incident. She just wore extra clothing to cover up the bite marks and the bruises and never said a word. In 1966, Robert was driving down the road and met a young lady just like he had met Sharon. He asked her if she would like a ride, and she refused. He ended up meeting her at a party that night, and they started talking, and they just really hit it off. And they fell in love, basically. And in that same year, pretty much, she became pregnant, and she had her little boy, and it was named Bobby. And when Bobby was 2 months old, Robert just said, "I've got a house for us." And he moved her into his mama's house, into the second floor. Then about a year after that, he put a ring on her finger, and they got married, and they lived happily ever after. Not, these stories don't end like this. Just joking, yeah. Didn't take long for Lynn to realize that Robert had a Jekyll and Hyde personality. She never knew what she was going to get. And one day, he was upstairs, and he hollered down to her that he wanted a snack. And so her family was there, and so she was busy entertaining her family, and he didn't think she came fast enough. So he just cut up all of her clothes, got in her closet and just cut up all of her clothes. And she came upstairs, and every single article of her clothing was cut up. Is that psycho or what? Very controlling. And one time she didn't do something he asked, and he just basically threw her down on the floor and just started choking her till her eyes bugged out. And Veronica was there, and Veronica didn't say a word. Of course, I'm sure she probably thought it was Lynn's fault, Great mother. And being sarcastic, you do know that, right? There's one thing that Lynn loved more dearly than anything else, and it wasn't Robert. It was her son Bobby. She was a good mother, and she did everything she could for him. But tragically, when he was only 9 months old, he had asthma complications and passed away. Lynn became very depressed. Lynn knew all too well that loyalty was crucial to survival in the Zarinsky household. Loyalty, secrecy, and obedience to Robert. She had learned her place in the 2 years that she had been in the family. Robert's next victim, Jane DeRay, would not be so lucky as Sharon. Life had been one heartache after another for this little 13-year-old girl. Her father had died suddenly when she was 8, and cancer took her mother 5 years later. The mother's death left Jane and her sister Joan, who was a year older, orphaned in the family apartment. Her mother's sister ended up caring for the girls. After this, on November 4th, 1968, Jane went to a high school game by herself because her sister Joan had a tummy ache. She would disappear that night. The next day, the aunt's husband looked for her and found her body in some tall grass near a railroad track. The aunt's husband did become a suspect after that, but he was eventually cleared. So 7 years later, 17-year-old Linda Balbanal, after working her shift at a drugstore, it was kind of late, and she was walking along the parking lot, and she went missing. And her body was found a month later floating in the river. She was nude from the waist down, but with no evidence of rape. A truck tire chain was wrapped around her neck, with her dress wrapped around her face and head, and tied with electric cord around her neck in a granny knot. Her hands were bound with a rope. Her shoes were missing. She had a fractured skull from blunt force trauma. Her jaw was broken, and she seemed to have been beaten on the face. An autopsy showed that she was strangled with an electric cord. This is where Rosemary Calandriello comes into the story. She's a shy, timid girl. She had just turned 17 and only just began to date. And she was the youngest of 4 children, the only one still living at home, and her life pretty much revolved around school, Girl Scouts, and her family. Rosemary's mother, Agnes, was a homebody. Her dad, Daniel, was sickly and had taken leave from his job at the post office. They rarely left the house, so after the sons left home, Rosemary got more responsibilities. She started grocery shopping and paying the household bills. That's a lot for a 17-year-old. So on August 25th, 1969, she was headed to the grocery store to get some groceries. As darkness started to fall and Rosemary still was at home, her mother went to the police station and reported she was missing because she was a responsible little girl. So she was always showed up. Their neighbor, Michael Hasseltine, actually was driving down Center Avenue with 3 of his buddies. He said he spotted Rosemary riding in a beat-up white Ford Galaxy convertible. He didn't recognize the older guy at the wheel. Hazeltine and the other boys talked about how strange it was that since she was so timid, why she was in the vehicle with the stranger. He'd never even heard of Rosemary having a boyfriend. And when the convertible turned in front of him, Hazeltine followed it. It was late summer, and him and his friends really had nothing better to do. So they just followed it. It looked to Hazeltine like the man behind the wheel was talking to Rosemary. It looked like Rosemary was sitting all the way over on the passenger side, really far. Hazeltine kept pace for 3 blocks, but then decided to go to a friend's house. But he had a photogenic memory. He was later able to tell the police exactly what the man and the vehicle looked like. Robert was then arrested for the abduction of Rosemary. The vehicle wasn't impounded, and they took a team of forensic investigators to search for evidence. A pair of blue bikini panties, size 5, were found on the left rear floorboard. There were spots of blood on the bumper, but there was not enough to analyze. And then they noticed on the passenger door, the door latch and the window crank were missing. The car was a trap. The girls could get in, but they couldn't get out. Sounds kind of like Ted Bundy. That's exactly what he did. Then they seen a ball-peen hammer on the floor. They thought there was a human hair in it, so they took their tweezers and plucked it out and put it in an evidence bag, where they were able to get samples from Rosemary's brush to compare them to. It ended up that it was not a match. Unfortunately, because they found that out, Robert's mother was able to make bail for Robert and got him home just for Christmas so him and his mommy could be together for Christmas. What a sweet family. Right after this, 2 more girls went missing during this time. Joanne DeLardo and Doreen Kerlucki were last seen walking along a busy avenue around 10 p.m. They had come from a neighborhood dairy store and were eating ice cream cones, just chatting away like girls do. Her father had dropped them off at a dance, and he was going to come back and pick them up. But he went home and he fell asleep on the couch. And his wife woke him up around midnight. And then they went searching for the girls and couldn't find them. So they ended up going to the police office and telling them. And then 2 weeks later, on December 27th, a cyclist discovered the girls' bodies along a remote country road about 30 miles away. They had been badly beaten around the head and shoulders. DeLardo's body was naked just from the waist down, just like Linda's had been. And Caluco's body was almost entirely nude. Yet police told their families there was no sign of a sexual assault on either girl. The DeLardo girl still had the black electrical cord knotted around her neck. So with more deaths occurring, they decided to go ahead and take Rosemary's case to the grand jury. And they were hoping that with the witness they had, that they would be able to prosecute him on only that, because they didn't have any body and they didn't have, really a lot of evidence. So they were going to try to take it to the grand jury in hopes that he would get convicted. And guess what? He did get convicted. 41 years later, after the murders of the officer, Robert's sister Judith decided to rat him out for when he killed the officer. So a trial began for that. And in 2004, with permission from Jane's sister Joan, they exhumed Jane's body, and also the clothing that she was wearing had been brought out from evidence. It was determined that the girl had not only been strangled, but she had been beaten, which they missed the first time. But nothing else came from her body as far as evidence. But on her clothing, it was a different story. They knew there was evidence on her clothing. It just wasn't enough at the time. So they had the semen stain from her slip, and they also had a bite mark out of her coat, and they sent those off for DNA analysis. And they come back and they matched Robert. And finally, after so many years, Jane and her sister had some forensic evidence that provided answers. Unfortunately, it never go to trial because on November 28, 2008, Robert died at a state prison in New Jersey of pulmonary fibrosis, a scarring of the lung tissue that made it difficult for him to breathe. Good for him, considering he strangled all those girls. He deserved more. And after that, there had been a more recent development, because in 2016, after half of a century, guys, 50 years, that DNA stays around forever, doesn't it? You're stupid to do stuff nowadays, I'm telling you. So many years, they were able to find out who killed Mary Agnes Klinsky, a senior that was last seen when she went to a mailbox to send a letter to her fiance in the Navy. So after mailing that letter, she went missing, and her body was found naked by road workers along an embankment at a park the following day. Authorities said at the time she had been sexually assaulted and her head was bashed with a blunt object. And because of recent advancements on how they analyzed the DNA, didn't take much of a sample to be able to find out who her murderer was. And guess who it was? It was our suspect, good old Robert. Imagine that. After half of a century, her murder was solved. He is suspected to have been involved in many unsolved cases. It just goes to show a criminal that eventually you will pay for your crimes in this day and age. With so many advances in science, you cannot hide the truth. It will come out. Guys, I'm glad you joined me today. And I hope you'll join me for Wacky World Wednesday, where I tell truly insane crimes from most of them are very dumb criminals. And then on Suspense She Shed Sunday, I tell these stories right from my she shed. So you guys come join me. You get to hear this Southern girl talking twice a week. Get you some sweet tea, and we'll just hang out in my she shed together and have a great time. I'm going to leave you guys with some safety tips like I always do. And you guys have a blessed day and a blessed week. And be safe out there. There's some crazies out there. And come back and see me, y'all. You hear? Bye.